Yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from California. Gentleman's recognized.
Speaker, let me offer some closing remarks and say that as I reminisce, having spent virtually my entire adult life as a member of this body, privileged to stand in this well for nearly 3.5 decades, making arguments, engaging in debate. As I said, I'm very gratified that we're able to work on one of the many final issues, the first issue of the lame duck session, in a bipartisan way, as my friend from Worcester just said. And I was privileged to work with him and to have him as a co-signer of this Dear Colleague letter that we sent out in support of this legislation. I'm reminded, having listened to remarks from both sides of the aisle, my California colleague, Mr. Rohrabacher, and others, that on the 6th of November, 1979, Ronald Reagan announced his candidacy for President of the United States. And he offered lots of eloquence, lots of brilliance, but he said something that at the time was seen as absolute heresy, not only here in the United States, but around the world and within this hemisphere. On the 6th of November 1979, Reagan envisaged this notion of eliminating tariff barriers among all of the Americas so that we could have the free flow of goods and services and capital and ideas and, yes, people as well. That's aspirational. That's a notion that he put forward. And a few years later in the Congress, I was privileged to be elected the day Ronald Reagan was elected president. I joined with my colleagues, Mr. Colby, Mr. Lewis, and introduced legislation calling for the elimination of tariff barriers among Canada, the United States, and Mexico that led to the North American Free Trade Agreement. Well, Mr. Speaker, the idea behind this diminution, in fact, elimination of tariff and non-tariff barriers, is so that we can enhance freedom, enhance opportunity, and improve the quality of life and the standard of living for people not only here in the United States, but around the world as well. And we understand that even in repressive societies, that if we can proceed with economic liberalization, political liberalization will follow. Now, I have to counter the statement that was made by my California colleague, Mr. Rohrabacher, about China. I am not going to stand here on the day that Xi Jinping has become the new leader of China and claim that things are perfect in China. But I will argue that permanent normal trade relations and China's accession to the World Trade Organization has been beneficial. Why? Because if one looks at the great leap forward in China, there were tens of millions of people who were killed. During the Cultural Revolution, well over 1 million people were starved to death. So you look at the great leap forward, you look at the Cultural Revolution in China, and you look today at the horrendous human rights violations that exist in China, and my goal is still to see us move towards political pluralism, the development of democratic institutions, a greater sense of the rule of law. But there are a few thousand political prisoners in China. It's horrible. It's not acceptable. But, Mr. Speaker, I argue that that is progress. And it was 10 years ago that I was very privileged to work with President Clinton in seeing China's accession to the World Trade Organization and permanent normal trade relations established. We were able to do that right here in a bipartisan way, and things are better than they were. They're not great, they're not acceptable, but, Mr. Speaker, they are better than they were. Now, I know there are some who, and Mr. Rohrabacher very thoughtfully did point to the fact that Russia is obviously not what it was like under the Soviet Union. I mean, we all can think back to the refuseniks. I remember adopting refuseniks, Jews who were unable to emigrate from Russia. And you think about all of the military expenses that went involved throughout the Cold War. Stories, and you know, I just came back from Georgia and Ukraine overseeing their elections, having been throughout Eastern and Central Europe and heard stories about the kind of repression that existed. And so, as bad as Russia is today, it's still a marked improvement over what existed during the Cold War in the time of the Soviet Union. And a lot of us held out a great deal of hope for Russia, more so than we have right now, just a few years ago, and because we've seen backward steps. I talked about my friend Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who at this moment is languishing in a Russian prison for simply criticizing Vladimir Putin. And I'm here today in large part because I want Mikhail Khodorkovsky to be freed. I want to see an end to that kind of treatment of individuals. And similarly, tomorrow marks the 3rd anniversary of the tragic death of Sergei Magnitsky. It was absolutely horrible that this 37-year-old lawyer, a young man with, as my friend pointed out, a wife and small children, was imprisoned for simply being a whistleblower, and he was tortured, abused, and left to die 3 years ago tomorrow. And again, in the 21st century, that is intolerable. It can't be accepted. It can't be accepted. And that's why we need to continue to pursue this effort on economic liberalization. Now, I'm not going to counter what my friend said about the importance of the Magnitsky component to this legislation, but I would like to share the words of some formerly incarcerated Russians, some of whom were incarcerated, human rights leaders in Russia who long before we did the Magnitsky language talked about how important this is. And let me just read a bit of this letter that is signed by 7 human rights activists. Alexander Lebedev, it goes down the line of these Russians who have been opposition leaders in the forefront. So before we did this, understanding how important PNTR and China's accession to the WTO would be, they said the persistence on the books of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment does not help to solve the problems with democracy and human rights in modern Russia at all. Moreover, it brings direct harm. This helps Mr. Putin and his cronies. Basically saying that repeal of Jackson-Vanik is something that is going to help undermine Putin and his cronies. They go on to say, those who defend the argument that Jackson-Vanik's provisions should still apply to Russia in order to punish Putin's anti-democratic regime only darken Russia's political future, hamper its economic development, and frustrate its democratic aspirations. We, leading figures of the Russian political opposition, strongly stand behind the efforts to remove Russia from the provisions of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which is exactly what this measure has done before. And so while I'm gratified that we've been able to, in a bipartisan way, include Magnitsky, there is recognition that simply repeal of Jackson-Vanik would go a long way towards undermining the political repression that exists in Russia today. Now, Mr. Speaker, I also have to say on this overall issue of trade, thanks are being spread around. I want to express my appreciation to my very good friends and colleague, Dave Camp, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and Kevin Brady, who chairs the Trade Subcommittee. I've worked with them for many, many years on the important issue of trade liberalization and our pursuit of ensuring we can create good American jobs, union and non-union jobs, by opening up these markets. And I also have to say that I know people like to malign the 87 newly elected Republican members, this Tea Party class of crazy people. I mean, you read that, you hear that in the media on a regular basis. And frankly, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, the leadership that they have shown on this issue and on the issues of Colombia, Panama, and South Korea are very, very important issues. So, Mr. Speaker, let me just say I express my appreciation to the fact that 73 of them signed a letter to the President saying that this need to be brought forward. We want to work in a bipartisan way to make this happen. I urge support of this rule, and then tomorrow when we have the vote on PNTR, a strong bipartisan support in behalf of the efforts of Messrs. Camp and Levin and Brady and others. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time and move the previous question.
Question is on ordering the previous question.